Are you keeping up with the Commodore?
Are you keeping up with the Commodore? 'Cause the Commodore is keeping up with you.
Because despite being released back in 1982, which was the year I was born, the Commodore is keeping up with us. And Commodore 64 emulation is easier than ever. Also, now we have this, the 8-bit DOE Retro Mechanical Keyboard, in this beautiful C64 color scheme. It even comes with super buttons and a joystick to play those Commodore 64 video games good. And I asked you on my community post and Twitter X if you wanted to see a cozy Commodore 64 emulation video with this keyboard. And you said, yes, TechDweeb, oh god, yes, please give us a cozy Commodore 64 video, you son of a gun. So obviously I've got to do it, because I'm your personal TechDweeb, and I'll do anything you ask. Anything. So that's the video today, a cozy Commodore 64 emulation video. So cue the smooth jazz, and let's get this aging gamer party started, shall we? 1982 style. First off, allow myself to introduce myself. I'm TechDweeb, welcome. Like all true retro game enthusiasts, I'm 40, I live in my mom's basement, I drink lots of root beer, I have a cat, I watch LGR, and I love tinkering with retro tech and emulating retro games. And for my nostalgic retro computer tinkering, nothing gets my dweeby juices flowing like a good authentically retro feeling keyboard. So before we get into the actual Commodore 64 talk, let's check this thing out, the 8-bit DOE Retro Keyboard, C64 style. I bought the 8-bit DOE NES style keyboard about a year ago, and it's been my main keyboard in my cozy retro game corner of my dork den. And when 8-bit DOE announced that they would be making a Commodore 64 style keyboard, I knew I had to have it. And if you need to have it, then I'll toss a link to this on Amazon in the doodad below. If you use that link, it helps me grow my channel and buy fun stuff to show you. So thanks for that, if you do. It comes in a nice box. There's some nice pictures on there. In the box, we get the keyboard. There's the joystick base, and I guess this is the wiggle stick. It goes right in there. We get a pretty nice USB A to C cable, and there's those super buttons. And it's cool that they match the joystick, and they also include some stickers if you wanted to decorate the buttons. And a word paper, of course. And then there's another word paper book of more words, and nobody cares. So obviously the biggest feature of this keyboard is the retro vibes. They tried to match the color and the style of the Commodore 64 PC, and they nailed it in my opinion. Everything from the color of the chassis and the keys to the small details like these molded ridges and the 8-bit DOE logo in the exact style of the C64 logo. Even the power indicator looks like it's the same as it does on the Commodore 64. One interesting departure from most keyboards, including the other 8-bit DOE keyboards, is the style of these keycaps. They have a concave top to them in this very unique kinda angular style. They're quite different feeling from most keycaps, so expect a bit of a learning curve, but I love the way they feel once I got used to them. The switches that we have on here are tactile Kale box white switches V2, which are classified as a typist's switch. I love the feel and especially the sound of these keys. Just listen to this clacky goodness. And of course, these are hot swappable switches, so you can always change out the switches if you get bored of these ones. The keyboard has 3 modes of connection. You can connect via USB, you can use the included 2.4 GHz dongle, which snaps into this little hidey hole in the back with a satisfying magnetic click. And you can connect it up via Bluetooth, and it doesn't have annoying issues remembering which device it's connected to. But another thing that's interesting with these 8-bit DOE keyboards are these rebindable super buttons. And the C64 keyboard also came with this joystick. All of this stuff is super easy to use. Basically, the super buttons in the joystick can plug in up top here. You can bind these to any keyboard function or hotkey combo. Just press the key mapping button and then hold the button or combo that you want to use, and then press the programmable button that you want, and it'll be bound. You can also bind these A and B buttons on the keyboard. It's easy to swap them around on the fly too. Like when I play pinball games, I love for these to be my paddles. It literally takes 2 seconds to bind these to any keys or key combos that you want. Playing games on this joystick is super fun. With the 2 buttons, it's a fun little setup for any 2-button game system like NES or Game Boy Color or Commodore 64. My only gripe is that these plug into the keyboard with a wired connection. It kind of kills the wireless vibe of the keyboard, you know? To have to deal with wires just for these buttons. It's not the end of the world, I just pull these out when I need them, but it's because of the wires that I don't leave these connected all the time. But overall, I am nuts about this keyboard. I love it to bits. But this isn't supposed to be a super in-depth keyboard video, and I've already covered the basics, so let's move on to talking about the Commodore 64 stuff. It was released in 1982. It was like the ultimate game console and super personal computer rolled into one glorious beige box. It had a whopping 64 kilobytes of RAM. Yeah, that's right, you heard me, kilobytes. That was a big deal back then. It could run games that blew our 8-bit minds, and it even had a fancy graphics chip and a sound chip that made some real nice bleeps and bloops. Yeah, those were the good old days, when floppy disks were actually floppy. It feels like just yesterday that I was at my friend's house revving up to play some C64, with those trademark sounds of it booting up, and losing hours of my young dweeby life to games like Maniac Mansion and Bubble Bobble. That's good times. But that's ancient history. These days, we don't need barely working big old beige computer boxes with built-in keyboards to play C64 games, because we have the magic of emulation. With emulators, you can run C64 games on almost any device. It's like having a time machine that will let you experience the 1980s without needing to actually go back in time and risk accidentally killing your younger self and altering the course of history. Like what happened to me that one time. With emulation, you get all the nostalgia with none of the hassle of loading up games on tapes and waiting around for noisy old disk drives. And of course, we get all the modern emulation perks like quick saves. You can save your game at any time. No more losing progress because your friend's mom called you up for dinner. Your friend's beautiful, beautiful mom who you still think about today. The method of emulating Commodore 64 games I'm going to show you today is using RetroArch. The only requirement on the PC is that you download the Vice Core, which is the best easy libretro C64 emulator. C64 games come in various types like tape, cartridge, and disc. The C64 was not just a gaming console. It was a full-fledged computer with a keyboard and joystick. RetroArch handles this by allowing you to switch between using your keyboard, which is called Game Focus, and controller mode, which emulates joystick controls. This is done with the scroll lock button. If you press that, you will enable Game Focus and your keyboard will act as the C64's keyboard. Push it again to turn off Game Focus and that'll switch to using it as a joystick for gaming. Some games use the keyboard exclusively, some use the keyboard for some stuff and the joystick for other stuff, and some just use the joystick. So you need to be comfortable switching between them. When you load a game, you might encounter an intro or trainer screen before the game actually starts. This is pretty common with Commodore 64 ROMs. Most of the time, you'll need to use Game Focus to push some keyboard buttons to get through this. Also, Commodore 64 emulation requires real-time emulation of the C64 hardware, which means that some things like game loading can take quite a while, especially if you're emulating a tape drive game. And that's where RetroArch's fast forward feature is handy, which is bound to the spacebar by default. You can just speed through this loading part. And one more thing, there are 2 special buttons that you need to know about. The run button, which is bound to the home button on the keyboard by default, and the reset button, which is the end button on the keyboard. Some games require you to press run to actually start the game. And that's basically the basics of how you emulate Commodore 64 games. There are some quirks of using it on handhelds because there you bring up a virtual keyboard instead of Game Focus, but the principles are the same. I'll let you figure that out on your own. But now I want to move on to show you a few cool Commodore 64 games that I've discovered. Starting with Badlands. This one's actually pretty neat. It's a top-down car racing game, but it's set in a post-apocalyptic Mad Max style world. You drive around the track, trying to come in first place, collecting wrenches, and then between the stages there is the ability to upgrade your vehicle with weapons and stuff. The gameplay is simple, there's not much to the metagame, but it's a fun game because the game mechanics are tight and the progression is satisfying. This is Death Sword. There are quite a few games like this on the C64. They're kind of just fighting games. However, lots of them, Death Sword included, just use the joystick and one button. The way they do different attacks is that you can hold the direction on the joystick and press the button. You'll do high attacks or low attacks or jump attacks. There's actually quite a bit of nuance to the movement and the rhythm, and it's fun to try to get good at such a primitive way of controlling a character in a fighting game. The graphics and the style are great here too. I just love the overall vibe of this game. It really reminds me of being a dorky kid back in the 80s. And this is Ultima IV. The Ultima series is one of the OG RPG series, and it's well loved for good reason. It's a deep, engaging story with an interesting premise, beautifully rendered cutscenes that still hold up well today, a unique character creation system, and a big open world ripe to explore. The controls on the C64 definitely take some getting used to. You'll have to switch back and forth between the keyboard and the joystick controls quite a bit. I'm not gonna say this is the best way to experience the game. Probably the DOS version is better, but it's not far off. And as a piece of gaming history, experiencing an amazing classic RPG in the way that someone with a Commodore 64 would have played it, I can think of worse ways to spend a Saturday night. And this is Blue Max, it's a plane game. It's like a scrolling shooter from an isometric perspective. You're flying a plane and you can shoot your gun and you can drop bombs, and your job is to fly and kill stuff and explode stuff. What's unique about this is that your plane has altitude. You can fly up and down, and you can tell how high up you are by your shadow. It's actually kind of strange that more games don't do it like this, to be honest. It works great. The mechanics are tight, getting the feel of dropping the bombs and hitting the targets on the ground. It takes some getting used to, and it's satisfying. I mean, it's just it's a simple game, and it's fun in its simplicity. And this is Flimbo's Quest. It's good. It's a game where you're presumably this kid named Flimbo, which is an amazing name. I think we can all agree on that. You have a wand that shoots fireballs. You walk around the level killing enemies and collecting money, and you can find secret treasure rooms that have lots of money, and you can save up the money to buy stuff from the shop, like upgrades. You need to collect scrolls so that the wizard can teleport you to the next level. What I love about this one is, unlike lots of games on the C64, the controls are tight, the frame rate is smooth, and the graphics are actually really impressive. Keep in mind that the C64 is somewhere between the Atari 2600 and the NES in terms of graphical capabilities. So getting a game that looks as good as Flimbo's Quest must have been a pretty big deal back in the day. It's simple, but it's genuinely fun, even today. This is the Great Giana Sisters, which is nothing at all like Super Mario Brothers. After all, these sisters are great, but not super. And they are sisters, not brothers. You can run around, jump, hit blocks, hit special blocks that give you points, collect a candy that powers you up, and you can collect a lightning bolt and shoot lightning balls, which is nothing like the fire flower. There are enemies you can jump on, underground levels, pipes, nothing like Mario Brothers. Not very similar at all. Back in the 8-bit days, games that were actually 3D were super rare. And this game, Stunt Car Racer, is probably the most advanced, genuinely 3D game that I've ever seen from this era. Keep in mind that the C64 is less powerful than the Nintendo NES. I mean, just picture this game coming out on the original Nintendo. Just look at the freaking graphics in this game. It's actually 3D, and it's nuts. You can see the track in perspective, and you can drive on the track, and the physics feel real. I mean, sure, it's like 10 FPS, but I guarantee that this game blew some minds back in the day. And the game is fun, too. It's basically Hot Wheels, driving on a narrow track, trying not to fall off, and there are big jumps and sharp turns, and the mechanics are tight. My mind boggles at how advanced this game is, considering it came out in freaking 1989. I'm speechless at how advanced this feels compared to everything else that came out at this time. And that's just a little taste of the gaming experience on the Commodore 64. There's a ton of really fun and interesting games that absolutely hold up. Lots that don't, of course, but even still, it's a hoot to experience gaming from a generation of home computing that paved the way for PC gaming experiences that we have today. I love it. This is just one of the coolest parts of retro games. Discovering games that I never played and learning about them and being transported back in time and picturing what it must have been like to think that this was cutting edge graphics on a home computer system that was revolutionary for the time. And if you're gonna do that to recapture the past, you might as well do it on a retro keyboard that adds to the nostalgia, right? I'm definitely planning on going through all the old C64 games to try to find all the best ones and hidden gems to share with you. So get subscribed if you like this video and want to see more Commodore 64 emulation stuff in the future. If you have any good Commodore 64 games that you know of, I'd love to hear about them. And I promise I'll check out every single one that you suggest in the comments below. But that'll do it from me for today. I'm TechDweeb. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.